Okay, thank you. So today I'm going to be presenting results from a study evaluating the factors influencing farmers' willingness to sell produce in a market outlets that address multiple goals of the food justice mission. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about farmers' willingness to sell produce through fresh stop markets. For now on, and for simplicity, I'm going to be referring to fresh stop markets as FSM. This project was funded through a Southern Sierra grant, and it is a collaboration between the University of Tennessee and the University of Kentucky. So in general, the food justice movement addresses various elements of the food systems that go beyond increasing consumer access to healthy foods. Some of the elements addressed by the food justice movement include unequal access to affordable, nutritious, culturally appropriate foods, the wellness of farm workers, social, economic, and environmental sustainability of family farms, among others. The vast majority of studies related to initiatives connected to the food justice movement in the context of local food systems focus mainly on consumer access to fresh fruit and vegetables at market outlets such as farmers markets, consumer-supported agriculture, or food hubs. Now, there are very few studies evaluating farmers' experience and engagement with initiatives related to the food justice movement. So, FSM is an example of an initiative connected to the food justice movement that is supported by a nonprofit organization called New Roots Incorporated. Specifically, this initiative addresses multiple goals of the food justice mission that includes facilitating, this is weird, okay, facilitating low-income, food-insecure households access to healthy foods, connecting small, limited resource farmers to markets, and facilitating community engagement that promotes and supports sustainable food systems and healthy eating. FSMs are markets that are set every 2 weeks in a designated location, which could be a community center, a church, or a business in a neighborhood that New Roots has identified as a fresh food insecure neighborhood. Shareholders sign up for the FSM for the entire 22-week season, and they pay 1 week in advance for a variety of 9 products that includes fresh fruits and vegetables. All shareholders paid exactly the same amount for this. All shareholders receive the same amount of food, but they pay different prices based on their household income, with share prices set up at $6, $12, $25, and $40 per share. In 2021, the largest percentage of shares were sold at the $12 per share. Traditionally, farmers selling produce through FSM are considered small, medium-sized, local farmers, limited resource, or minority farmers. So New Roots, in partnership with communities, coordinate all marketing efforts, which means there are no costs associated to maintaining and recruiting buyers from the farmer's perspective. Additionally, New Roots is responsible for aggregating and delivering that food to FSMs to decrease the logistic burden to farmers. Additionally, New Roots provides information about volumes and kinds of produce farmers could sell through FSM. Using data from a 2020 survey of Tennessee and Kentucky fruit and vegetable farmers, we evaluated the factors correlated with farmers' willingness to sell produce through FSM. Why is this information important? Well, this information could help communities interested in replicating the model to assess those farmers that are more likely to be willing to sell produce through FSM, but also to design strategies that can attract these kinds of farmers. We use the expected utility model to assess farmers' willingness to sell produce through FSM. The first equation is the expected utility model framework that we use to kind of like compare the decisions to sell and not to sell produce through FSM. where FSM and no FSM represent the decision to sell produce through FSM and not sell produce through FSM. NFI represents non-farm income. Phi FSM and Phi no FSM represent the profits associated with selling and not selling produce through FSM. And Z represents other factors such as farmer values, goals, and motivations for farming. The second and third equations in this slide provide additional details about the profit components in the first equation. One of the most important components in the first profit equation is this 1 minus D component, which is the D represents the price discount farmers will face when selling produce through FSM, and that price discount is over retail prices. So we hypothesize that farmer I will be willing to sell produce through FSM if the expected utility of selling produce through FSM is greater than or equal to expected utility of not selling produce through FSM. So the data we used in this study comes from a survey, a 2020 survey of Tennessee and Kentucky fruit and vegetable farmers that was conducted between February and May. The contact list consisted of 961 farms representing fruit and vegetable farms in 32 counties in the East Tennessee region and 14 counties in the Louisville and Lexington, Kentucky areas. So, of course, the selection criteria of these counties had a little bit to do, to be honest with you, a little bit with our budgetary restrictions, but also the fact that we were conducting another survey of Tennessee fruit and vegetable farmers during the same period of time in certain counties, and we wanted to avoid farmer survey fatigue. So, of course, the selection of these counties for this study is gonna affect what? The representativeness of our sample and our ability to generalize some of the results. Later on in this presentation, I'm going to be discussing the representativeness of our sample. Okay, so there were 161 respondents or individuals who completed the survey from the 961 included in our contact list. That represents about a 17% response rate. This was a mixed mode survey that consisted on a web and paper versions. And some of the questions included in the survey instrument had to do with farmers' participation in food justice related activities, farmers' willingness to sell produce through FSM, and farm business characteristics. In order to explore the farmers' willingness to sell produce through FSM, we used the contingent valuation approach. We had some challenges. We had a limited number of markets that we could present to respondents or that could actually represent the reality of selling produce to FSM. So all respondents were presented with the same market scenario. Before eliciting farmers' willingness to sell produce to FSM, we provided them with information about FSM. The information we provided to them is on the left-hand side of this slide. So after providing them with information about FSM, we asked respondents to indicate their willingness to sell produce to FSM at a 25% price discount market scenario. So that price discount was over retail prices or the highest paid market for them. Then, depending on the responses to the first price discount market scenario, they were presented with a higher or a lower price discount market scenario, set at 30 or 20%. How do we develop these market scenarios? We develop these market scenarios using information from interviews we conducted with the executive director of New Roots and 3 farmers that were selling produce through FSM and that at the time were actually providing more than 50% of the produce sold through FSM. So we hypothesized that farmers' willingness to sell produce through FSM was a function or was correlated with farmer values, goals, motivations for farming, and other farm business characteristics. Y1 on this slide represents farmers' willingness to sell produce to FSM at the 25% price discount over retail prices scenario, and Y2 represents farmers' willingness to sell produce to FSM at the second market scenario, which could be 30 or 20%, depending on the responses to the first market scenario. We use a bivariate profit regression to simultaneously estimate the parameters in equations 1 and 2. So the maximum price discount farmers are willing to accept when considering selling produce to FSM could be assessed by looking at the responses to the first and second market scenarios. So the last four equations here represent the four joint probability market scenarios we estimated marginal effects for. Okay, so we hypothesized that the variables correlated with farmers' willingness to sell produce to FSM were age, education, experience selling produce to farmers' markets, farmer values, goals, and motivations for farming. So how do we capture that? We look at some variables capturing farmer participation in food justice-related activities. Specifically, if they were providing discounts to low-income households, or price discounts to low-income households, if they were donating produce through food banks, if they were providing or offering education programs in their farms related to sustainable food systems, and if they were somehow involved as leaders or volunteers in organizations with a food justice-related mission. Of course, given the limitations of our contact list, we wanted to assess the representativeness of our sample. So how did we do that? We basically compared the size of the operations in terms of acres in fruit and vegetable production. Those operations included in the survey and regression samples with fruit and vegetable farmers in Tennessee and Kentucky, according to the 2017 Census of Agriculture. As you can see on the graph on the left and this information on the right, is we tended to overrepresent those larger farms in the 5 to 25 range for Tennessee. For Kentucky, unfortunately, we didn't have the information to do this, but we also tended to overrepresent those larger farms. Okay, so we assessed the respondents' willingness to sell produce to FSM. In this figure, I'm actually presenting, we had a total of 112 observations for analysis after eliminating those respondents that were not producing fruit and vegetables in 2019 and those who were selling or have sold produce to FSM. There were a total of 85 observations for analysis after eliminating 27 observations due to missing values. As you can see in this graph, more than half of those respondents were willing to sell produce to FSM at a 25% price discount market scenario. Still, half of those were willing to sell produce to FSM at a 30% price discount market scenario. On the other hand, from those who indicated not willing to sell produce to FSM, only 14% changed their mind about their willingness to sell produce to FSM when the price discount market scenario was lower. Results suggest that farm income dependence is correlated, as you can see from the marginal effects across all joint probability scenarios. Seems that farm income dependence seems to be correlated with farmers' willingness to sell produce to FSM. For example, in the marginal effect on the first column suggests that there's a correlation between farm income dependence and the joint probability of willing to sell produce to FSM at a 25% and 30% price discount market scenarios. Nonetheless, the positive and negative signs on these two columns suggest that those farmers are also sensitive to changes in price discounts when considering selling produce to FSM. Additionally, the results here suggest that farmer participation in food justice-related activities is correlated with farmers' willingness to sell produce to FSM. A good example are the marginal effects related to education, that running education programs on the farms that suggest that basically running education programs on their farms seems to be correlated with that farmers' willingness to sell produce to FSM. Nonetheless, it's important to show that given the positive and negative signs here, that suggests that those farmers running those education programs are also sensitive to changes in price discount market scenarios. So to conclude, I mean, as you can see from the results, it seems that farm income dependence is significantly correlated with farmers' willingness to sell produce to FSM. Nonetheless, those respondents that are more dependent on farming income tend to be sensitive to changes in price discount scenarios. Finally, of course, farmer engagement with food justice-related activities seems to be correlated with farmers' willingness to sell produce to FSM. And this information is critical for those communities interested in replicating this market model to identify those farmers that are more likely to be willing to sell produce to FSM. Of course, I need to highlight several limitations of this study related to the survey sample that were targeting 32 counties in East Tennessee and 14 counties in the Louisville and Lexington, Kentucky areas. And the fact that our survey design did not actually allow us to estimate the maximum price discount farmers will be willing to accept when considering selling produce to FSM. And with that, I will end my presentation and I will entertain any questions if there are any. No problem. Oh, sure. Rachel.
Thank you for this presentation. So I know you have a small sample, particularly once you read it out all of the did you look at this prescriptive statistics to see what was different with the two-part question for the ones who responded by computer and then the others? And then among the other categories, did you separate them by if they had an email address and did respond that way and then send a survey versus one with no email address or by state? I mean, I'm just wondering about that. That's a problem if the survey is truly anonymous.
Very, very good question. So actually, we had a very low response on the web version of the survey. And indeed, from our contact list, only the Tennessee farms, we had access to email addresses. From the Kentucky, we had to start from scratch, go to a state sponsor market program, and literally get the contact the addresses. I'm talking about low responses, like I had like 20 responses from all the responses that were web version. It was a very low response. So good point. I don't know if the comparison will make sense because of the very small sample. So I don't know. But very good point. Yeah.
Yeah, and then within the rest of them, you were able to differentiate between the one who sent it out to you and the opportunity for the web, and then the other one, or between the two states?
I can, I'm able to do that, but very good point. Rachel, I'm probably wanna look deeper, but only that for Tennessee, right? So for Kentucky, we didn't even have
Was that separate?
The contact list came from different sources. The service was sent exactly at the same time for both companies. So if the timing was the same, the contact list came from completely different sources. That's why one had email addresses access and the other one didn't.
And you don't know which state an individual.
Not for the mail version, no, it's completely anonymous. For the web version, because in quantity you can send a list, so technically, yeah, you have, even though you're not supposed to, but yeah, you have. Okay, no problem.
Follow-up questions? Margarita? Next up is David.
Right. Thanks for coming to this session today, guys. As Ian said, I'm James Keeler from the University of California, Davis. What I'm going to be talking about is kind of looking at producer choices in regards to the repair for agricultural equipment. Specifically, I'm going to be addressing the question of when markets for agricultural equipment are competitive. And by competitive, I mean there are multiple providers of equipment. Is there an incentive for manufacturers to, or a profit incentive for manufacturers to restrict producer or farmers' ability to repair a tractor or any other agricultural equipment on their own? Examples of these kind of restrictions include locking buyers or consumers or farmers out of the software that they need access to diagnose issues with their tractors, engine control units, and the like. There's also the issue of end user license agreements that include authorized dealership clauses, but overall just kind of a general various mechanisms through which manufacturers can just make it more costly, more difficult for buyers of agricultural equipment to actually do the repairs themselves. Now, this isn't just an issue for agricultural equipment. You've probably seen something similar for phones, cars, appliances, Kind of the topical issue in the pandemic was with repairs for ventilators. If we come at this kind of a very shallow economic theory approach, and we might say that we would expect forward-looking repair conscious consumers to just go ahead and buy the bundle of equipment and repairs that's the cheapest, easiest to repair, all else equal. But what I'm going to show today is kind of a theoretical model that says that isn't necessarily the case, that it may be that, or it is true that, or it's possible that producers may have an incentive to restrict repairs. And specifically, there's going to be an interaction between repair prices and this repair restriction itself that's going to drive kind of the result. So why should we care? Over the last decade, there's been the right to repair movement, which kind of looks at trying to push for legislation that would mandate manufacturers to provide access to repairs, access to diagnostic tools that are needed on fair terms for consumers of equipment, buyers of equipment. Specifically in terms of like state legislation, Massachusetts actually has a bill that's been passed for cars. Nebraska has looked at a set of bills that have not actually been passed yet. But I think it's over 20 state legislations have considered right to repair bills. At the federal level, the FTC kind of set out a report kind of looking at the anecdotal evidence to these repair restrictions and the potential for policy. And then more recently, the Biden administration released an executive order that explicitly kind of mentioned the ag industry and repair restrictions. But overall, there's kind of this question that's open in the air of, do we need this policy? Is it going to be beneficial for farmers, for other durable goods industries? And should this policy be broad? Should it be specific? And what I hope to do is provide a baseline or a foundational model that can address those kind of questions. The quick stats fact of the presentation is that there are about 4 million tractors in the US, a fairly large population. And the costs of repair restrictions are more than just higher repair prices, the cost of transporting a tractor to a dealership. It's also, if you have a breakdown in your tractor and you can't fix it on the farm, you have that breakdown like during harvest, there can be substantial losses in farm profits. And this is substantial enough that there's anecdotal evidence that farmers are going out and buying entire backup tractors just to have a backup if something goes wrong during critical operations. So previous literature that's looked at this, there's really only one paper that's directly looked at the right to repair from a theoretical point of view. And that's by Jin Yang and Zhu. And what they use kind of a single manufacturer model with consumers that have various levels of ability to provide their own repairs. But what they find is kind of a very ambiguous outcome. They can't really identify exactly whether or not right to repair is going to be beneficial, harmful, or have next to no effect. And that they show that market and product characteristics play a significant role, specifically the idea that if there's a competitive primary market, a lot of what they found could really change. And kind of their big conclusion that's relevant for my work is that they say that an interesting direction for this kind of field is to look into studying the effect of competing manufacturers on the incentives to restrict repairs. And that's what I plan to do. In terms of literature that directly works with the model that I'm going to present, Borenstein and et al. In 2000 was sort of the capstone on a set of literature that followed from the Supreme Court ruling on this Kodak issue, which is looking at product tying and aftermarkets, and kind of had the same question that I address, but kind of more focused just on the price. And what they show using kind of a differentiated Bertrand duopoly, which is what I'm going to use, is that there are incentives, and actually pretty mathematically robust incentives for manufacturers to raise prices for repairs in the aftermarket above marginal costs when the market is tied. So what do I do? Again, my question is, I want to figure out if competitive markets for agricultural equipment sort of reduce or eliminate the incentive for manufacturers to restrict repairs on ag equipment or other durable goods. What I present is kind of this theoretical model where I just allow manufacturers to make that choice. I allow them to work out whether or not there's going to be a profit incentive and decide there. Where my model kind of differs from the main literature is, again, I'm going to include repair restrictions as this explicit continuous choice variable for manufacturers. And then I'm expanding the choice that the buyers of ag equipment or durable goods have with regards to providing their own repairs. And that, in a sense, makes them a competitor in the repair market. So the way my model is set up is I have two equipment manufacturers. I call them A and B. They are going to be the exclusive dealers, exclusive providers of both their own equipment in sort of the primary equipment sales market, as well as the only providers of their repairs except for consumers. Buyers, on the other hand, they kind of have it's a two-period model where in the first period, they purchase their equipment. In the second period, it will break down and all equipment will break down and all buyers will have to purchase repairs to kind of repair their fixed loss utility from the breakdown. Both purchases and repairs are going to be compulsory. And then kind of to summarize, is just buyers are going to kind of have this decision on whether or not they're going to buy equipment from either manufacturer and whether or not they want to provide repairs themselves. Manufacturers will then choose kind of both the price for new equipment, the price for repairs, as well as to what extent they're going to engage in a restriction on repairs. And this is all going to be said in the context of a Bertrand duopoly with this vertical differentiation according to quality. This quality is only with regard to the equipment itself and not the repairs. And I'm going to assume that manufacturer A is the quality leader. I'm also going to assume that buyers are uniformly distributed with regard to both their preferences for quality of the equipment, as well as they have their own individual self-costs to provide their own repairs. And this is kind of the alphabet soup portion of the presentation, but again, just to summarize, buyers are going to have 4 choices that we can summarize kind of into 2. First choice is, do I want to buy equipment from manufacturer A or B? Second choice is, conditional on my choice to buy from A or B, do I want to buy repairs from A or B as well, or do I want to provide repairs myself? And the way that the restriction for repairs is going to enter into the model is through this gamma value. And basically it's going to act as a markup that manufacturers place on the individual consumer's personal cost to repair their own equipment. So how does this model kind of work out in terms of setting up a demand system? If you've seen a hoteling model and you think about extrapolating that into kind of a 2D setting, that's effectively what I'm doing here. I'm going to derive market shares by having this unit square, which kind of captures all of my consumers according to where they are in terms of their individual self-cost for repair and their preference for equipment quality. And the standard solution concept for a hoteling model where you identify sort of all the different indifferent pairs. In my case, we have 5 pairs of indifferent consumers. And for example, here I have identified sort of this line that says, here are all the consumers that are indifferent between purchasing equipment from manufacturer A and purchasing repairs from A, and in the contrast to purchasing both equipment and repairs from B. And so we can kind of say, have that line cut across the unit square that has all my consumers, and I can assign sort of that area on the top goes to A, and the area at the bottom goes to B. Then we can do that again with another indifference line. And again, you just keep doing this 5 times, you cut up all these, the unit square, and you end up getting sort of this description of, or a visual depiction of how market share will respond to changes in both manufacturer prices as well as manufacturer degree to which they're going to restrict repairs. This is I'm not going to be able to actually get into detail on this during this presentation, but all this is basically a visual depiction of the demand system that I'm working with and how I'm going to look at how market shares change in response to manufacturer choices. So for manufacturers, again, they're going to simultaneously set new equipment repair price, new equipment and repair price, and they're also going to set that level of repair restriction gamma to maximize their profits. I make an assumption, generally a marginal cost for all equipment production as well as repair provision, as well as restricting repairs. All of the marginal costs there are going to be 0. Marginal cost assumption for repair restrictions, you can kind of think of it as a agricultural equipment provider saying, well, I'm not going to provide you a manual. I'm not going to provide you this tool to open up the hood to work on the equipment. I also make kind of a standard assumption in terms of like a Bertrand price competition model. And it's just going to be maximizing profits subject to what I call our unit square non-negativity constraints, which is just making sure all the choices stay within that little box. Okay. My goal here is to basically prove whether or not there's a Nash equilibrium where gamma is greater than 0, meaning that there is a point where both one or both manufacturers is content to restrict repairs and they're happy to stay there. The way I'm going to show this kind of proof is to show it visually and see how we can see how the incentives work. But complete analytical proofs will be kind of forthcoming in the paper. The first result that I have, and kind of my main result, is that the equilibrium where both manufacturers restrict repairs is not a Nash equilibrium. The way I do that is kind of like a pseudo proof by contradiction. I assume that the equilibrium, we're in the equilibrium where there's no restriction on repairs. And I say, at that point, it's just going to be price competition. And it's going to be a standard differentiated Bertrand model where manufacturers are going to say, well, I'm going to continue to decrease my price to increase my market share up to a point. And here I'm going to assume, and we're going to just kind of, for illustrative purposes, have that point be where both the prices are set equal to 0. So it's, in that case, there's very little differentiation between the products. And kind of showing that. So again, we're going to, with just the price competition, the manufacturers are going to compete down until their prices are, close to 0 or small, close to whatever their marginal costs are, which is here 0. And that's just the visual description there. The next step that I have is basically, let's just kind of hypothetically have A raise their repair price by some small epsilon. And what this is going to do is it's going to reduce their market shares, but at the benefit of there being a higher price applied to their total market share. But however, since we assume that PA star equals 0, the equilibrium value is 0, they should in theory be worse off. B is going to be better off because they're just gaining the market share from A, given their decision. However, kind of the key result is that when you allow manufacturers to restrict repairs, not only can they raise the price, but they can recoup the losses in market share by kind of saying, I'm going to raise my price, but I'm not going to let consumers find it optimal to provide their own repairs because I'm going to restrict them. So again, the model ends up looking effectively the same visually, except there's going to be a slight increase in B share. But there's this trade-off between this equipment market share loss and raising repair prices and restricting repairs that kind of allows or permits or increases kind of the likelihood that manufacturers are going to engage in repair restrictions. So that depending on how kind of we set the model parameters, there can be incentives to restrict repairs. So my conclusion, so what I find is that there may be profit incentives to restrict repairs, and that these incentives depend on the levels of prices, restrictions, the levels of new equipment prices, the discount rate, the value that buyers place on repairs in the future, as well as the distribution of buyer costs and preferences. And there's kind of this, what I'm working towards is trying to kind of put this in the context of how the own price elasticity of demand for repairs can kind of describe this trade-off. And kind of my next main steps are to bring this more to ag in terms of looking at those timing issues of, well, if we have a breakdown during harvest, what does that mean in terms of the context of my model, as well as kind of the moonshot idea is to, instead of having a linear setup for consumers' costs and preferences, consider that as more of a nonlinear distribution, or maybe there's going to be more consumers in an industry that are more able to provide their own repairs relative to another industry. That's all I have. Thank you.
That's very interesting to become model. I was thinking in the context of how the technology evolves. So if I think in the context of a simple factory, they see an average small, medium-sized farm in my state, for example, where they rely on the kids because they don't have their release lots of stuff. But when I think about a larger employer, cotton, corn, it's not only a function of, I read it's a function of the process of the manufacturer, but not allowing for them to do it, but also the complexity of their technology.
Mhm.
When I add a yield monitor and other components that is like that a farmer will not be able to do, right?
Yeah.
So it would be interesting to understand this. I mean, to be the context of a basic technology
like we put it in from the sort of simple class and like, how does that decision get affected and from the manufacturer perspective and the political, I mean, this is complex in terms of.
Yep.
There is.
No, I agree. It's kind of the part of the reason you have the right to repair issue is because of that increasing complexity of technology. It's why repairs are valuable. But as technology becomes more complex, repairs become more valuable, and you kind of run into this issue of this specific issue of right to repair becomes more important.
What is the role of repair industry? I think they can repair at a lower cost than the suppliers and others. We're trying to push that national to the towards the point that it becomes epsilon higher than the place where the owners and the repair themselves.
In terms of the, so you're saying independent repair provider or that?
Independent that can.
So if we're saying that like independent repair providers are kind of specialized and they have this advantage on providing repairs, if we introduce them into the model, it would definitely, like, if you're going to give them consumers another option. This is kind of a very linear model where consumers, if there's a choice between repairing something themselves, going to an independent provider, or going to a manufacturer, independent repair is generally better than like all the consumers. It is going to push things more towards kind of in the sense that we have more competitors in the repair aftermarket. And so that's what I would expect. The model is actually set up in a way that we can add complexity like that. You just kind of get more cutting all the market share different ways in terms of you add like applicant options and stuff. But here we're just thinking.
So you assume it's definitely failing period. What if you introduce, what if there's uncertainty about when you make a purchase decision, will it or won't it break down?
Yeah. That kind of augments the big underlying thing is kind of how much do producers value repairs. If repairs aren't likely versus if they are likely, and mathematically there's a lot of ways to treat that. And really it's depending on how you want to treat it mathematically. If you're going to think like just a probability and you're going to take an expectation on utility, then maybe this is going to become less of an issue because some people aren't going to have breakdowns. But at the core, you're still like tractors are still going to break down. Kind of the simplicity here is that when I start adding probability of breakdowns, it keeps on a lot of complexity in terms of how I think about utility. And I'm trying to kind of avoid complexity on the utility or the consumer side. I'm focused on manufacturers, so I just want to make it simple.
I imagine even without manual, some getting around that.
One really strong repair system is in terms of the software, and it can kind of say that, think of it almost like a tamper evidence script on like, or a screw that you, once you turn it, the computer knows that you've met it. And they have something to that extent where if something breaks down, even if you fix it, that error code is still there, and you have to do it clear and the energy function starts. There's been an effort to kind of hack factories, and I can tell you how difficult it is. I think like Caltech is the main group that's working on that, and it's not simple, and it's clear that to put that kind of effort into fixing repairs tells you that there's some potential incentives.
Okay, well, I think there is, I wouldn't feel from studying.
Sorry. Okay, thank you everyone for coming to this talk today. I'm happy to talk about my paper here. My name is Taun Jung. I'm a fifth year PhD student and I'm in telemarket this year. So the paper is titled Efficiency and Equity of Post-Price Market for Irrigation Water. So this will be about the study for the water market design. So let me begin this talk by addressing the water scarcity issue. So especially this year, the water scarcity has been one of the greatest threat to irrigation community here in America. So many Western government, state government has cut substantial amount of water that was supposed to be delivered to the farmers for irrigation because water was not sufficient. So in this time of year of water scarcity, water markets can be extremely useful because water markets can transfer water from low value users to high value users. So we can conserve water and we also create value through marketing, and that value will be redistributed to the farmers back. However, water markets are not without challenges because usually the high transaction costs may hinder water trading from occurring. Those costs include, it's just difficult to find the partner to trade with, and also many times it is complicated procedures to get through the state government's approval. In order to reduce this type of transaction costs, one way we can do is to make market smaller. So make market localized so that we don't have to worry about this transaction cost. And this is an example of what actual Australian water market do. So different color here, it represents the different trading zones. So by assigning the trading zone in a smaller scale, in which the farmers can trade without worrying about these approval procedures. Maybe environmental economic impacts may be small enough so that making this market small can be realized under this trading zones concept. This is what I am focusing on this study. We're gonna focus on the mechanisms that how these existing trading zones operate. And we find that they're operating based on the bulletin board markets. So they're operating the bulletin board markets in the following way. And this is also called post-price market. I will explain why and where we got this title from. So the bulletin board market is basically a place where sellers and buyers come together and exchange their trading information. And with the internet access, this became even more popular. And now it became like online platforms. The example can be thought of as Amazon types of platform mechanism. Let me give you some example how this is actually popular around the world for water trading. So there's many regional markets in Australia where they actually use this website to promote water trading. And there's some growing demand for the water trading in America here as well. So having this lots of examples in that's been already in place for water trading. However, we have not really fully understood what does this do to water reallocation. And also we want to know how this platform economy is gonna redistribute the welfare that's generated through the marketing back to farmers. Prior studies have looked at different mechanisms such as double auction markets, but have not considered seriously about this type of internet-based the exchange platforms. That's exactly what we are doing here. Since we are modeling the water markets, we characterize water markets with these two features because these two features we believe that makes water markets distinct from any other general commodity markets. First, traders are heterogeneous. The heterogeneity here is defined by how different farmers are in terms of their valuation. So the valuation of water here is reflected value of various production vectors, including what crops farmers are growing, where the farm is located, and so on and so forth. The more relevant question is that how much the heterogeneous are depending on the regions. So if you think about the California, farmers are growing very diverse types of crops, right? So therefore, their value for waters are extremely very different across each other. On the other hand, if we think about some other regions whose farmers are growing relatively similar crops, then accordingly, their value for water will be likely to be similar, even though it's not exactly the same. So that's why we are making this differentiation between low level of heterogeneity versus high level of heterogeneity. As I said, high level of heterogeneity water markets will refer to more like California markets versus low one.
And the second feature is the market design. Market can be designed either recursively or non-recursively. The recursive markets can be thought of as a market where it is continually open throughout the year, like more an Australian water market. They open the market, doesn't close it, just to keep operating it. On the other hand, American water markets tend to be more non-recursive because here the water trading is once a year type of trading in many regions, like an annual water auction, for example. So we are making these different points, and this is really the choice of the market managers. We can design in either way. So we want to understand how this design choice will drive the difference in terms of the market outcomes. So putting things together, we are primarily concerned with the effect of heterogeneity and also this recursiveness of market design to understand what does it do to market outcomes with respect to the efficiency and equity. Here we define efficiency as the proportion of the realized welfare compared to the potential gains from trading. And equity will be defined by the relative share between buyer groups and seller groups. So how evenly the value will be redistributed towards buyer farmers or seller farmers. Let me give a summary before we jump into the more technical parts. This is what we do. We evaluate the effect of heterogeneity and the market design of recursiveness, focusing on this special new emerging technology for water trading, bulletin board trading. And this is also called PP markets because in this bulletin platform, sellers post prices. So this is more academic terms, but this is identical. We do this by developing a model of thinly traded market. The thin market here is because the localized of the market. In some market, there can be only few sellers, so their strategic behaviors need to be considered. This is what we find. We find that this platform water trading will not always efficient and equitable. It will deliver efficiency and equitable outcomes if we design the market in certain ways. These certain ways, I mean by two conditions. First, non-recursive market design and the highly heterogeneous traders. If we miss one of these conditions, we might expect higher efficiency, but lower equity or vice versa. So let's start looking at how these PP markets actually work. This is the snapshot of the existing water platform in Australian water markets. And we're going to learn 4 features here to understand how this market works. First, the water prices are publicly available information. There's no cost that buyers can search this price at free, the cost. And these prices are not the single, there's no single market price. Individual sellers are making their own price decisions. So and sellers are capacity constrained. This is a unique feature for the water trading because sellers only get to sell when what they're allocated given that year for the water amount. Lastly, buyers are making individual decisions as well. And these individual decisions made by buyers and sellers make this market very interesting because now we are in the world of a decentralized economy where market clearing does not hold anymore. We might have to consider types of specific frictions that governs this economy. Well, we extended the existing model of frictional search literature by including two-sided heterogeneity, where sellers compete for the prices and buyers compete for the search. Like I said, this is the frictional market. So we account for the appropriate types of frictions, and we find that there are 2 types of frictions that governs PP markets differently. And these frictions will differ by the degree of heterogeneity. Let's first look at the low level of heterogeneous markets in this left figure. Note that the slope is relatively flat across the buyers and sellers. This reflects the low heterogeneous market. And congestion frictions might arise if several buyers happen to choose the same seller because of this decentralized economy nature. And since the seller is a capacity constraint, it's going to choose one of the buyers, and therefore we are losing the welfare. This is the congestion friction. On the other hand, the mismatch friction might arise if the market becomes more heterogeneous. Note that now the demand are steeper and sellers are steeper as well. As I said, this is more the reflection of the California types of the water markets where farmers are are very different in terms of the value. The mismatch friction will arise in order to understand that we have to consider these extra marginal traders here. Their trading is going to lead to the inefficiency because if they trade, you see my cursor? Oh yeah, sorry. If these guys trade, we're gonna lose a bigger pie of the efficiency, which could have been realized if we do not include these extra traders. So having these two types of different frictions that is governing PP economy, which differ by the degree of heterogeneity, come to our next concepts of understanding the efficiency, how we can improve efficiency under this, the platform economy. Well, the key is to effectively control two types of frictions differently. First, like I said, to eliminate the mismatch friction, we have to deal with these extra marginal guys out of the market. And also, we need to have the sorted matching behaviors in order to promote higher efficiency by eliminating the congestion friction, even with these intra-marginal traders. The sorted matching behaviors is the type-specific matching pattern between the buyers and sellers, like the following way. So type 1 buyer is matching with type 1 seller, and in that order, type 2 buyer matching with type 2 seller, and then we can realize the entire welfare. The order doesn't matter. Type 1 buyer can be matched with type 2 seller, the other way around. As long as there is some sort of rule, which is sorting, we can realize the higher efficiency. That is the concept of improving the efficiency here. So having this in our mind, this is the time to report our results. So the effect of recursiveness trading is going to generate the different outcomes depending on the heterogeneity, because as we saw, there's a different types of frictions that differ depending on the level of heterogeneity under the market. So first look at the high heterogeneous markets. We find that the recursive market trading design is going to decrease efficiency and also decrease equity. On the other hand, if the markets are not too heterogeneous, recursiveness is going to increase efficiency but decrease equity. The reason underlying mechanism for this outcome is based on this one. Let's first consider the equity outcome here. We find that the recursiveness is going to incentivize the sellers to increase their markups regardless of their heterogeneous level, because they can anticipate the better payoffs in the recursive design if they know that they have another chance of trading in the future. So they're going to increase their markups, and this results in decreased equity regardless of heterogeneity, right? However, as we saw in the previous slide with the figures, we saw that the different heterogeneity will have a different impact on different types of frictions, and therefore we will have a different outcomes on the efficiency. To be specific, we find that the recursiveness will only correct congestion frictions, and that was the governing factors only for the low heterogeneous markets. That's exactly why they're increasing efficiency only under this blue bar, only when the markets are low heterogeneous. But that effect doesn't appear if the markets are too heterogeneous, like here in California case, for example, because if markets are heavily heterogeneous, we should also consider mismatch friction, which cannot be corrected by recursiveness of market design. So let me conclude this talk by summarizing what I said so far. In this paper, we consider two most important market outcomes, efficiency and equity. And we consider the market design. And we find that the non-recursive market design is the key to promote efficiency and equity. But that result will be limited to when markets are highly heterogeneous traders. So if I confuse anybody so far, I would like to highlight just one message, which is that market design will not deliver the same outcomes always. We need to be understanding in the context of the market environment, which in our case, we consider the level of heterogeneity of the traders, so that we can anticipate the better economic outcomes by introducing some sort of market design, which in our case, the recursiveness of market designs. So final comments, who cares about this research? Who wants to design a market? Well, I would say anybody who wants to create a market. Well, in our water scarcity era, we are in the time of growing demand for market creation. Many irrigation districts and GSA, the groundwater sustainability agencies, under Sigma, the policies, we need to create a local market here in America. So I believe that I hope that my research can be helpful to deliver the insight that we can design a market better way. If we have to create a market, let's design a better way and anticipate a better outcomes. Thank you.
Question.
Very interesting thought. Now, one thing, so with what I think some markets, the non-recursive was the one time, correct? Like and now, in some cases, in Nebraska and other places, right, that type of market, there's also a clearinghouse mechanism then, that then instead of having, you know, there's limited time to post in to buy or sell, and then there's some algorithm that comes in and says, what's the best way to map these things? So how does that, you know, if you have that, how does that affect? It seems like then if we get a common view, if I understood not the difference.
So surprising, there was my original comparison on this topic. There was comparing clearinghouse and post-price market mechanism. And I found that clearinghouse will deliver always better compared to this one. But what we focused was that this one is simpler. Farmers have a low instance of participating in types of markets because we're so familiar with anagram trading. But the downside of the clearinghouse market is it is expensive. We need to develop an algorithm continuously, and we also have to make sure that farmers are incentivized to report the correct value. So there might be some cost to that, but the mechanism-wise, we find that really delivers a higher efficiency and high equitable the outcome. So I guess it's just a matter of the cost and the operation and the material.
So, you started off with that slide of the local markets and part of Victoria. So, and you talked a lot about California. What do you think of the geographic extent of one of these markets? California. Okay, because the way, so there's two things about water in California. The surface water is allocated to a water district, and not allocated to individual farmers. And so I was thinking, well, does she mean within a water district? That's what I was thinking when I studied this one. Yeah, so it is within a single district. Yeah, that's usually the case, because in terms of the water rights, the irrigation districts that have hold its own water rights and they share the within their district that they can just proportionate. So in that sense, it's easier to implement this type of market within the district. It's not always very proportionate, it might not cost. And so then the other comment I'll make is you should then be looking at heterogeneity within the water district. So a lot of the time it's not that heterogeneous. So that's how I see. Just let me go in a smaller area. And then the other thing I'll say, and this is true anytime you look at the water market, and I think there are no good answers, but it's in California, it's if you need to lose the water right. So, you know, if you keep selling and selling the water, it's always I don't know. I think it's something that is under kind of the study right now. Like if we would try to everybody understand that might be a problematic in promoting water trading when we understand that this is necessary. So I think it's more administratively correct that needs to be made. Well, it's a property right. I mean, that's what there's no good answer. But the underlying property right is Nobody does.
Thank you.
So I have a student with a bit of much of a dissertation on civil conflict over water between countries. Originally from Palestine. So is there any literature on thinking about trading of water rights across national boundaries in Europe? Local? Would it be possible to set up an international market or a regional market across national boundaries?
Across national boundary, that's even more complicated.
No, you have a river that flows to.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. I don't wanna go talk about the conflict in game theory there, but I think there's a lot going on in terms of water conflict. But I think a purely economic standpoint, I think it should be working in terms of the perspectives on the degree of heterogeneity and what the design will work and influencing the strategic trading behaviors. I don't think there's a reason why we cannot expand it to regions across the border, as long as that satisfies the conditions. But I think it's more discussion on that topic. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I get to go last. So I'm going to talk a little bit about private food standards, and I'm particularly interested in the idea of self-reporting of non-compliance. Now, I've written quite a bit about labeling, but I've never thought about private standards in any great detail, and I haven't thought about compliance issues in any great detail. But just so that you know where this came from, I'm actually doing a law degree at Ohio State just for the heck of it, and mostly because I'm a trade economist who thinks about trade policy issues. But I had to do a regulatory compliance class, and we had to write a 3-page essay on a compliance issue. And I happened to find some really interesting papers in the environmental economics literature about, so under the Clean Air Act, you're obliged to report violations of the Clean Air Act. But under the rules, if you self-report, there's a potential that you won't be penalized as harshly by the courts or the EPA than if you didn't self-report. And I sort of thought, well, this sounds like something that could maybe be adapted to thinking about private food standards. And I don't think much has actually been written about compliance with private food standards. There's a lot of descriptive analysis in the literature. So the background is that, private standards have become a much more important means of governance of food systems in industrialized countries. And there was a very nice survey, I think it was in Applied Economic Perspectives and Policy, that came out recently that took a look sort of broadly at the literature. And I could find nothing in that paper that explicitly talked about incentives for compliance with these standards. And of course, part of this process of moving to private standards in the food processing, retailing industries is that the monitoring of compliance, it's not being done by government agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency. It's being done by accredited third-party certifiers. And there's a very nice paper in Food Policy back in 2005 that sort of talked about the growth of private third-party certification. So why have we seen this growth in private standards? Well, there's a big literature on this. Spencer Henson up at Guelph and his colleagues have written extensively on this. And I think typically the usual arguments are that, we've seen an increased growth about concerns about food safety. We know from work that I've done, work that Rich Sexton's done, there's been this huge increase in demand for different product attributes that, remember, these are typically what we would call a credence good. So you need somebody to resolve the market failure problem of lack of information. Arguments that globalization has led to this increase in use of standards. And of course, from a legal standpoint, many retailers are now legally liable for food safety or any other issues relating to food product attributes, and that's why they're interested in implementing these systems. Now, it turns out, you know, as you read the literature, there's a huge debate that goes on about, you know, public law, which is typically government setting rules, agencies enforcing those rules, and then the courts penalize firms that are caught in non-compliance. And I guess the environmental issue is based on federal law. But there's this new growing body of literature, it's called private food law. And lawyers are writing about it, philosophers are writing about it. There's a concern that we're shifting from public regulation of industries towards private regulation of industries. And that that's very interesting literature, but I'm not going to talk about that in any other detail other than to say that, you know, these standards are being set by a private body, be it retailers and processors or whomsoever. They're being adopted and implemented by private firms, and compliance is being evaluated by a private auditor, and they're being enforced through private certifications. So this is a totally different system to public regulation of something like standards. So the bottom line is I'm interested in, you know, what mechanisms might ensure compliance with private standards. So if you go and read the law and economics literature, of course, I'm doing a law degree, and what I tend to do is read the law and economics literature. And I work with a trade lawyer who said he doesn't understand economics, and I'm an economist who says he doesn't really understand the law. So it's sort of interesting to move into that area. So Gary Becker wrote the seminal paper on this issue, and his argument was that you apply the maximum sanction to somebody who breaks a rule. And because what this does allows you can have a given average sanction with a lower probability of violators being caught, but you have less enforcement effort. So Becker's argument is, if you set the sanction correctly, you can economize on enforcement costs. So this is sort of an efficiency argument. And then Malik, who was an economist, actually, I was reading the footnotes of his first paper. He was actually an economist at ERS at the time, and he argued that the problem with the maximal sanction is that violators then expend resources to avoid being caught. So there's that's an inefficiency that you're introducing into the problem. And then the paper that I've drawn on for this particular presentation, because I'm really at the earliest stages of thinking about this problem, is a paper by Kapler and Chevelle. If you know, Chevelle writes extensively in the law and economics literature. In fact, I find papers of his all over the place in all kinds of things that I happen to be interested in. And they show, and this is what I'm going to talk about, is that self-reporting of violations do actually result in enforcement cost savings. And what got me into thinking about this was I came across the environmental economics papers first before I started looking into the law and economics literature. And the papers there, they focus on, you want to set the rules such that you get the benefits of remediation by firm. You actually want firms to admit they've done something wrong and to try to remediate that. So you can introduce that into the problem. I'm not going to talk about that today, but just bear in mind that you can put that into these models. And then you need to think about reduced avoidance costs and enforcement costs. And Malik, again, has a very nice paper, but it turns out, I think Rob Innes has pretty much a monopoly on writing in this area in our profession, and has a whole series of papers in a variety of journals where he talks about remediation benefits in particular. And then he has a very nice paper in the Journal of Political Economy where he talks about the incentive effect of having reduced sanctions. And I haven't got it here on the bullet point, but there is quite a nice empirical literature, particularly looking at self-reporting under the rules of the EPA. And that's really what got me into this. So I'm not going to claim anything original here other than maybe the way I introduce. This is not a criminal model, so there's no potential for imprisonment for anybody who breaks the rules. So I had to think about what might be an alternative to imprisonment, you know, the ultimate sanction, if you like, and that's what that's where I think I want to take this research. But just to sort of lay this out, so I'm going to assume incomplete contracts between processors and retailers. In other words, this is a vertical contracting problem, and there are going to be post-contractual transactions costs. And the only way that these can be minimized is by some sort of private standard, let's call it F, that is subject to third-party certification. Now, if you know anything about the legal literature, if you had perfectly written contracts, you could write them in such a way as to cover all contingencies. And then you could potentially think about torts. So torts would be where, in this case, a retailer has decided that a processor is violating the rules and knows who the tort fees are. That's the legal jargon. You take them to court and you sue them, and they have to pay compensation. Okay, I'm ruling that out by assumption because we're just assuming that these contracts are too incomplete. So this thing called F, the standard, it describes the product requirements, call it Q, that the retailer or a group of retailers demands. And what I've introduced here that's not in the other literature that I'm drawing on is that the retailer has a reputation, and that reputation is based on, safe food or high quality food, or whatever you want it to be. And this is indexed by brand equity. So think about a food retail chain or a food retailer. It has a brand that this is really what's valuable to these companies that are typically low margin firms. It's the value of the company name on the balance sheet that matters. So I'm just going to call that B, and it's increasing in the quality or the product requirements being met by food processors. Now, I've adopted to do this the simplest way, which was to assume that the processor is risk neutral, but you can write down the problem by introducing risk aversion. It just gets messy. It doesn't really change the results that much. It's just more complex to solve out the problem. So a food processor chooses whether or not to comply with the standard. And if they don't comply, of course, they impose damage on the retailer. And that damage is essentially you hurt the retailer's brand equity and their reputation. So if you don't comply, the processor gets some benefit, just call it little b. It comes from the set 0 to infinity. But this benefit differs amongst firms. So you make assumptions about the population of firms, although in the mathematics, you just normalize it to one firm to make the solution pretty straightforward. So I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly because I don't want to abuse the fact that I'm the last speaker and the session actually goes on till 2:30. So I'm just going to give you a flavor of what the results say and then finish up. So the third-party certifier is going to audit with some probability P, but it's costly to audit. And if a food processor doesn't comply with, there's going to be a sanction, just call it S. And that sanction would be, and this is the bit where we don't have much sense from the literature exactly what sanctions are that get imposed on food processors that don't comply with the private standard. This is a private system. There's no reporting. There's no expectations that you see. At least I don't know of any papers that report this stuff. But typically, the literature that I have seen suggests that you don't get certified for a specific period. And there's going to be some maximal sanction, call it S bar, that's going to be greater than or equal to the damage that's imposed on the retailer. And that is going to be a financial loss imposed on the food processor, and that financial loss is going to be the loss of being not certified for a period, plus recertification costs. Now, if you could make this a really complex repeated game, of course, you'd have to introduce discount rates, et cetera, et cetera. So the food processor is obviously not going to comply with the standard if the benefits of doing so outweigh the expected sanction. And you can write down a little welfare condition. Again, I've normalized, it's been normalized. That's why that PC term at the end is just refers to the singular firm that we're looking at here. So just to state the result, the optimal sanction then is S bar. And if the sanction, the optimal sanction S star is actually less than that, what would you do? You would increase the sanction and you'd lower the probability of audit in order to keep the expected sanction constant, but you'd get less costs because you're not evaluating as many people who are potentially violating the standard. That's the Becker result. This is just a reproduction of the Becker result in the setting that I happen to be interested in. And the equation at the end is just on the left-hand side. This is the cost to the processor of non-compliant, and then this is the damage minus the costs over here. I mean, the mathematics is kind of tedious, but it's kind of an obvious result. So if you introduce self-reporting, and this is where I want to take this, and this is kind of as far as I've got so far. I'm at a point in my career where I don't present papers that are actually really completely thought through, because I want to maybe find out I'm comfortable enough doing that. So if you have any ideas, I'll be very happy to hear them. So the sanction for self-reporting shouldn't be greater than the expected sanction for okay. So just without working through all the algebra, other than the fact that that welfare function now, the lower limit is this thing R, and the auditing cost is going to be different in a system when you have self-reporting, is that you can essentially end up with a situation where you lower the probability of the audit. The process of self-reporting still pays that sanction R, but the auditing costs are lower. So self-reporting adds this additional efficiency gain. And this is a result that Kaplow and Chevelle established, and Robin is re-established in a number of other settings. And all I've done is translate it here into thinking about private certification. And then it just leads to a different first order condition there. So essentially, the left-hand side is the same, this is obviously the same, but this is now, you're dealing here with the marginal cost of auditing a processor that isn't actually doing anything wrong. And this is just the inframarginal effects on the end of the equation. So the bit that I'm really interested in, because I'm trying to tie together two literatures that I've been thinking about. A few years ago, I gave a paper about chickens. The paper about chickens was to do with chlorine washing of processed chickens, something that the Europeans don't like. And the issue there is socially responsible production and the potential for NGOs to boycott. So I'm trying to tie together this idea of private certification, compliance, and what might be a maximal sanction, which would be this idea of the threat of a boycott. So in another paper that I found, I think this was in the business literature, certifiers typically, my little simple model is you just don't get certified for one period, but you can make this a little bit more complicated if you want by having a gradual system of sanctions where you might have a warning. So you didn't comply, you get a warning, we're not going to do anything right now. Then you lose your certification. That was my sanction that I had in the two cases of no reporting or self-reporting. But the ultimate sanction would be, and this is the equivalent to imprisonment, right, is a complete exclusion from the standard. Now, I'm interested in the idea of adding in the sanction of public exposure, right? So this is a private system, but you're going to publicly expose a bad player or bad players, where the idea is if you basically report that a firm has violated a standard, was warned, was decertified for a period, is a repeat offender in some sense, then you tell an NGO, you put it out there for a non-governmental organization, and they will organize a boycott of the processor such that you never get your product on the shelves ever again. And this is equivalent to imprisonment in a criminal law setting. That's my argument, okay? So the role of NGOs in boycotts, Barron, if any of you work in this area of socially responsible behavior by firms, Barron has written extensively in this area, and I really encourage you to look at those papers if you're interested in thinking about corporate social responsibility. That's not what I'm thinking about here, but he's modeled boycotts frequently in his work. And then Rob Innes, again, Rob has a fantastic paper in the Economic Journal where he looks at boycotts, and importantly, it's costly to implement boycotts. So with non-compliance, now if you introduce this second punishment, you've got two sanctions. You've got S1 and S2, where S1 is the sanction for damage inflicted on the retailer. That's what it had in the previous two examples with reporting or without reporting. And S2 is a permanent loss of retail shelf space for a processor due to a boycott. In other words, you're never going to sell your product again because no retailer is going to buy a product from somebody who repeatedly violates a private standard and is going to damage the reputation of the retailer, or they're going to be litigated against because they're responsible for food safety. So, but there's a boycott cost, and that boycott cost is made up of it's costly to the NGO to organize. And that's what Barron's papers write extensively about, how you organize a boycott, how you raise money for a boycott, how what's the optimal behavior of a boycotter. So I haven't introduced that explicitly here, but that's where I want to take this next. And then, but there's also a cost to contesting a boycott. It's not costless to fight an NGO that's lobbying to boycott your products with the public. So again, I don't want to take up any more time. In fact, my time is up. I'm just going to say here that if you introduce this additional sanction, okay, and what happens is the monetary costs of non-compliance, they're applied with certainty now, but the threat of boycott is reduced, right, when you have this self-reporting in this kind of system. So you can achieve a given level of deterrence by the third-party certifier at a lower cost with a lower probability of audit, because processors that don't self-report face a much greater sanction through boycott. Okay, now, if it works properly, nobody ever actually gets boycotted. And remember, it's costly to boycott. And think about, going back to the imprisonment example, the social costs of imprisonment are very high. So you want that sanction to be there as a credible threat, but it doesn't necessarily get implemented in equilibrium. And obviously, you can probably tell it's got a very Chicago flavor to this way of thinking. So just to summarize, and then I'll be happy to take any questions. I can't find any serious analysis of incentives for processors to comply with private standards and the role of third-party certifiers. So that's really what I'm just throwing this out there as a way of thinking about a problem. What I've done is just adapt an existing paper so that I don't offer any original thinking in terms of model, just a way of adapting it and saying, hey, this might be an interesting thing to think about. And I've applied this to private standards to try to, and it identifies issues relating to incentives of compliance, what sanctions might look like, what's the level of deterrence, and auditing costs. These are all issues that I think matter. And I don't think they're issues that we thought very carefully about. We have private standards, there's loads of them out there. In the development economics literature, they worry about, can farmers in developing countries actually meet these standards? But I never see any discussion about compliance, at least not extensively. And I think what's important here, and I think that's why we have to think about standards carefully, is it highlights there's reputational risks for two players here. There's a reputational risk for processors, and there's a reputational risk for retailers. And that might be obvious, but I think if you include that into the way you think about this, that's what drives the model. And in other words, you've got processor boycott, you've got damage to retailer brand equity. So one way you could take this, and there is a literature in environmental economics literature here, is you can focus on an enforcement mechanism that encourages self-policing by the processors themselves. And that there is actually an environmental economics literature on that. That's a little bit different from what I've talked about, where you just self-report if you find you've done something wrong. Start thinking about remediation benefits. Why don't you start thinking about self-policing? It may go on, I don't know. So that's why I come with the last bullet. I've done this, and I find no empirical work in this area, and I cannot find any data. If you know of any data sets, that would be great. How do we evaluate these things? And understanding how these standards operate, I think would be valuable just in terms of allocation of resources. So thanks very much. I'd be happy to take questions. Otherwise, feel free to go and get yourself a cup of Starbucks out front. So thanks for your attention.
I'm trying to think. My brain's trying to go to us, and how to help us to do this. I'm thinking about private content. How can the issue of non-compliance come to place? Like I'm thinking in the context of farmers markets and their federal regulations. I go to farmers market and I see farmers giving samples with an eye, a piece in the hand and saying, would you like to try? Yes, that's valid. So, if they go to it at home and see if it's compliant with some, that's not gonna happen.
Right.
There are penalties, but they're not gonna be enforced because of that. In the private context, please, as a person, when you go to a whole certification process, is because you have to insert this certain market as a participating market. So how can you create this of non-compliant? Here that they already have an incentive to participate in market. And a third party is like an independent business that they discover. I mean, there is money to come and testify, right? So they're paying you to come and testify. So I was just trying to think about how like the issue of non-compliance.
So your argument is processor has it's in their own best interest to comply with the private standards for.
So they might have already incentive rather
Correct.
than being penalized.
Okay,
So they have.
so then we would never have, there's no compliance for it. That's what you're arguing.
Well, I was trying to think
That's my
about,
point. We don't have a list. Does anybody know of data on rate compliance with private standards?
probably no, because of private standards, they don't report that, right?
Right,
That's not,
Exactly.
so yeah, no, for that, I don't know.
But the presumption, you have a standard, you have a certification system. I mean, there's quite a lot written on making sure that the third party certifier is reputable and doesn't get captured by the processor or the retailer.
Yeah.
That's actually, that's a well-developed experience. But in, this recent survey in private economic perspectives and policy, and then I found another one. I think it's food policy, I can't remember. There was absolutely nothing in the literature about, it was about why do we have standards, types of standards we have, what are the nature of the companies that do the certification, but nothing about compliance. I mean, obviously I did a course in regulatory compliance as a law student, and therefore I'm interested in the non-compliance. And the empirical work actually in environmental economics, and my colleague Atul San worked with Rob Roberts' PhD advisor, and we did work on this. And the empirical work shows that self-reporting does what these models suggest. You do get higher rates of compliance because you self-report and you don't get you either don't get fined. You don't get fined as much. And the big debate was about people are scared of self-reporting because they think they're going to be punished for self-reporting. But the literature is actually quite clear about slightly lower sanctions get put in place. So and there's other literature that does suggest that self-policing, which I sort of didn't talk about here. So this would be sort of internal evaluation of whether you actually view yourself as a company and meeting standards. In environmental economics, the evidence suggests that those firms who can establish a reputation for being self-policers don't get audited as frequently, and you then focus your enforcement efforts on firms that aren't self-policing. And I think that's another way to think about it. So, I'm just thinking about the economics of compliance in the way that third-party certifiers might behave, because a little bit assume, my previous papers was just go to the third-party certifier, boom, it's done. Don't worry about non-compliance. Rachel, I think
I mean, there's a couple of things. So I'm thinking about the idea that the processors like boycott environmental, what's different from the retailers that continue to deal with.
Yeah.
So then it seems like then the processor needs to be identifiable to consumers. So it's a subset, I think, of products, to get a grocery store. And then of course, if the processor can be boycotted, then the retailer brand equity also be damaged, and there must be some sort of trade-off.
Yeah, that's good. So I think the argument would be that I guess it's maximum sanction is you can never put your product on any shelf.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like you get shot in the market square, the argument, but it never actually has to be implemented.
But yeah, I mean, so that it's either, if you're shot in the market square, it still has to be that consumers know that, or else the retailers hear that they can find out. I mean, yeah, but when you have like the absolute punishment, then you're already set. Then the other thing I will sort of explain this, but I can't fully articulate it. So I'm thinking about these private standards, and there's two kinds of private standards, right? There's one that's somehow higher than a regulated standard, and then there's one that's an attribute, on an attribute that's not, doesn't have a regulatory standard of score. And I think that those lead to different incentives in terms of the sanctions, like, fine, I didn't meet the private standard, so I'm going to sell the separate market. So this would be more like, I don't know, page 3A, so that was probably expected to be,
Yeah.
the natural. So, I mean, I think, that's just something else to think about, because I do think there's very different incentives.
No, you're,
Absolutely, and that's a very interesting point, what you're saying, because like, there's not like a global stuff, that are like, okay, so that might be, I don't know, the meaning, so they said you're not gonna get somebody who's gonna buy, versus saying, please turn my work, and so I'm gonna track a market, and they certify me in what incentive do I have to not comply for a while, because there's not a huge.
It's like the regulation, so.
Exactly.
So, yeah, so that's also the case for the floor. They have to regulate on the floor.
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, you could probably put in a minimum standard for public. It wouldn't be that hard to do that. I mean, I'm sort of interested in, people being worried about, the world is going to a world of private law. For another day, but a mix system is what you're presenting.
Yeah.
And that wouldn't be that hard to put that minimum.
And what would be interesting is to contrast it to different kinds of attributes with the minimum public standard in the town.
I go back to the farmers market settings and I see a lot of non-competition. I mean, somebody has that with, organic, right? Which is like, they have a flexibility and there's the manager of the farmers market is coming to say, hey, by the way, you're not certified that you cannot post that thing there. You see a lot of that, or the counter, and you see a lot of non-compliance because the cost of enforcing and the manager doesn't have a specific one. Or if you have a incentive, and I'm not saying no, but I've seen those non-compliance instances, and I live considered here on the market.
I'm not wondering now, so, about something below or something like that. Yeah, I think on the free side, that you also in mitigation. So once you do mitigation, you have to start to put back to private coverage.
You want to talk about food safety.
No, I'm because then there was more support, so it's something like for support.
That is where you can get process of boycott and damage to utilities.
Yeah. Okay. So, one way to like to improve this is the time where we have to just finish the part. Thanks a lot for coming and enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you.
Bye.